I'm going to just wrap up. I'm not going to do all of the content that you've got there, all you're free to look through it, and we may have a video that covers it all that Paul may be able to send round. I want to just talk about the management world, structural world, and the organisation itself. Does anybody know what this thing on the left is? Say again? No? No. Good guesses? It's actually, allegedly, the world's first modern organisation chart. Right? And it was drawn up by the guy with the magnificent beard in 1855. And he was a supervisor of this railroad in the States, and it was drawn up in response to the first ever fatal railroad accident. Okay? So somebody died, and therefore he was asked to draw up an organisation chart. And from this chart, and this applies to organisations and to commissioning systems as well, in-house, out-house, etc., we get two stories about the possibilities of organisations. So the first story, the negative story, says that the purpose of drawing up the organisation chart was to make sure if there was a fatality in the future, we knew exactly who to blame. Right? So that's a story about organisation charts being, which undoubtedly they are particularly good at, allocating responsibility and ultimately blame. Okay? And the other part of that story is that being a railroad engineer, he drew it up in the only way that he knew how, with lines and switches, and that's what gives us this basically mechanical model of the organisation chart. Right? So that's the negative story about organisations as kind of killers of human freedom and potential and spirit and the potential for us to deliver value in the world, and we're all a little bit at least familiar with that story. Okay? There's a positive story about organisations that comes out from this as well, right? What does that actually look like, that thing on the left? Looks like a tree, looks like a living thing. Right? And actually, you see the root ball down right at the bottom there? That's the directors nourishing at the roots. And it's symbolically interesting that the directors are at the bottom of the organisation. Right? And what was the big data revolution that Daniel McCallum was dealing with in 1855? What spread out along the lines of the railroads across the continental United States? The telegraph. Great. So for the first time in history, head office could interfere in virtually real time with the operations down at the very end of the line, right? So this positive story about the possibilities of organisations is that Daniel McCallum was trying to create an organic structure that maximised the discretion down at the branch lines, down at the front line of delivery, consistent with bringing good, valuable information back to the centre to make longer-term strategic decisions. So that's a story about organisations as empowering, as creating human dignity, as creating the possibility of delivering change in the world. And both of these stories apply. A brilliant guy. The first kind of real organisational architect, and you can read his whole plan of organisation, his whole kind of report, a book about the structure of the enterprise architecture of this railroad. So those two possibilities are inherent in all of your systems, and we just heard a snapshot, in terms of provision. We've got, provision which is all about meeting the targets and too many overheads, and it's painful for them as well as for us, but it costs more and so on. And we think there's a possibility, let me use your example, Will, of the in-house thing, the infusing and the culture and the positivity and the doing the right thing, guiding our behaviours without the need for all of these command and control things, except you had quite a command and control, chop them off if they're wrong. Fair enough. If that gets you the system you want, that's what works. It's part of the culture. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so that's the possibilities that we are creating as we structure these systems. It can go one way or it can go the other way. And who knows this? Probably every personal development course you've been on recently has had the blind men and the elephant. Do you know the story of the blind men and the elephant? It's not very good in terms of its political correctness. I apologise. Actually, there's a version of it where they're not blind, but they're going out walking, these 9 men, and they learn that there's this big elephant. This is night time, and it's in this big dark barn. And they each go in with their own little candle, and each of them describes the elephant differently. So this one says elephants are sharp and pointy and dangerous, much like a spear. This one says elephants are big and heavy and hard, and however much you push, you just can't move them. And this one says elephants are kind of like snakes or string, and actually they smell really, really bad, right? And this is usually used in a fairly glib way, thinking about whole systems, to say, while we all have a different experience of a different part of the system, if we just bring all of our candles together, share our perspectives, we'll illuminate the whole system, right? Are you familiar with that kind of idea? We can see the whole elephant, we can understand how the pointy bit and the smelly bit and the... Actually, that's just not true, unfortunately. It's partly true. Sharing our perspectives is a good thing. If you could understand how everybody in this part of the system actually related to the whole thing, you'd learn something, right? But because the position of the elephant you're in determines your whole experience of the system, your way of relating to the working world and your responses and your behaviours, it's not just that they can draw their bit of the elephant and you can put it together and you've made a jigsaw. It's actually a fundamentally different perspective, a different way of understanding, of behaving around the whole thing. Does that make sense? Yeah? So if you're doing organisational change, or you're doing commissioning, or you're bringing people back in-house, and you bring your brilliant new initiative to the people at the sharp, pointy, dangerous end of the elephant, how are they likely to receive it? Well, as sharp, pointy and dangerous, because that's what their world is like. Yeah? And if you offer it to the people at the stringy, smelly end of the elephant, they're likely to receive it as just more elephant dung, because that's what their world is delivering to them. Yeah? And I've seen incredibly positive organisations on the surface in local governments. Look, we were doing a rapid improvement event with a special educational team in a London borough, and all kinds of things were wrong with the facilities management. Now that sounds like a small thing, but it was a winter like this, and because somebody had complained that the radiators weren't hot enough, facilities management had come around and ripped the thermostatic valves off all the radiators. So they were all on full blast, 100 degrees. We were in this little workshop trying to improve the system of special educational needs, and we had to have the window propped open with 2 fans blowing in the ice cold air just to keep us awake, right? And we had the chief executive coming down to visit us and understand and sponsor and back and all the rest, support all the rest. And one guy who'd been inspired by this rapid improvement methodology and really wanted change to happen for the kids, took it on himself to try and fix this heating problem. And he wrote to the people in charge of facilities management for the area. They didn't respond, so he wrote to their boss. And what do you think happened? The boss over there spoke to his boss bollocked him and said, get back in your box. And that get back in your box meant don't do any more improvement work, forget about it, the system is not open for change. Right? And that just killed our entire piece of work, not to mention we were glad to get out of that sauna. So you get the idea. You don't necessarily, so all of these things are creating conditions that people experience. Let me make it slightly more real. You've all got them in front of you. Never mind. I normally do a little bit of a guessing game here, but this is very relevant to everything we've done so far today. In citizen world, we go about our lives. We have complex needs, we have purpose, we have problems, we have communities, we have assets, we have weaknesses, etc. Right? In service world, we're trying to respond pragmatically to all that complexity coming in from the environment to try and meet the needs. Does that make sense? And the invisible divide that divides service world and system world, we call the front line, a military analogy. We're dug in, defending against the oncoming onslaught in our trenches with our bayonets fixed. And it sometimes feels like that, right? And very importantly, no information comes across that boundary unscathed. You get customers with A, B and C shaped needs come to the boundary, and we see customer A, and we say, okay, you look a bit like a triangle, we'll give you service triangle. And we say customer B, and we say, well, you don't look like anything, bugger off. And what happens? That goes back into the system, becomes more complex, becomes more needy, or learns to look like a triangle, or turns up at a counsellor's surgery, or whatever else. And person C, we say, you look a bit like a 0, we're going to give you a circle-shaped service, right? And then we bring A and C into the system and give them slightly the wrong service. And what does that mean? It generates more complexity and more problems, more for system 2 to try and deal with in balancing out. We're trying to deal with somebody as a triangle, but actually they're an A, so actually their needs turn out to be more complex, and we have to do more specification and more fitting to their needs, and that creates more churn and turmoil and expense in the service world. Okay? And that's the point of power, though. If we can actually listen to what people need and really co-design with them as they come to tell us what their needs are, that's where we start to deal with demand better and can start to push it back out into need and purpose. In management world, we have to use rationality, because if you're a manager and you're not behaving in a rational, coherent, logical way, then what good are you, right? But the rationality of management world rubs up against the pragmatism of service world, where they're just trying to deal with the complexity of what everything is thrown at them. Yeah, so you get all of these messages from management world. Why aren't you behaving in a more rational, understandable, coherent, logical way? Wouldn't it be better if we structured you much more clearly so we could understand you better? And service world is going, no, but we're just trying to deal with all this stuff. And the invisible divide between service world and management world is performance information. So no information crosses the boundary unscathed. So whereas we had A, B and C come in here, we don't notice B because we couldn't, they didn't fit our categories. So all we say is we've got a triangle and a circle coming in here. By the time that gets communicated to management world, we say 2 units of service have been successfully delivered. So all you see in management world is 2 ticks. So this information gets mutated as it goes through the system, right? And then we've got politician world, where you've got to work according to votes or ideology, which again doesn't fit with the rationality of management world. And does anybody know what the invisible divide between politician world and management world is? I still don't know. So I'm hoping somebody will come up with a name one day for it. But there's definitely a divide there, right? And by the time information comes out of management world and into politician world, well, it's certainly got nothing to do with what the citizen actually said at the front line anymore. It doesn't communicate that view of what the organisation is actually doing out there. So as commissioners, you have to understand that these 4 worlds, and by the way, of course, there's many more than 4, because even if you just do one of these for health and one of these for social care, you're already into a world of far more complexity. These are all like different bits of the elephant. In some bits it's solid and immovable and unbudgeable, in some bits it's sharp and pointy, in some bits it's dungy and smelly and rank, right? Occasionally wet. And that means that in each of these different worlds, people are thinking and reacting and responding in very, very different ways. So when you bring your brilliant idea from management world or from workshop world to the front line and you say, I've got a great idea to empower you, and they're dealing with dung or with spears, how are they likely to respond? Not very positively. But from your world, you're not going to find it easy to understand that, because you get the idea. Yeah? So as commissioners, you've got to not get stuck in commissioning world, whatever that is, but you've got to have the flexibility to understand the experiences of each of these different worlds and understand how they relate to each other. And it's incredibly explanatory. If you just go for a minute, if I was in this world, if I was in somebody in the learning disabilities team and this and this and this was happening to me, how would I respond? And oh yeah, well of course, that's why, of course they're responding that way, because that's the way anybody would respond. And who has seen, just to give this as an example, somebody who maybe was out here as maybe a manager, a contract manager of subcontractors in the single provider, who spends their entire working week basically slagging off the people at the council, saying they're incompetent and they're useless and they never give us the right specifications. I guarantee you, if you bring them in-house into here, within a week, just like that, they'll be slagging off the providers, saying they're incompetent, they never deliver what we ask them for, we give them very clear requirements. You get the idea. So position in the world, your experiences determine your point of view, which determine your perspective and your thinking and everything else. So you have to link those worlds. So the organisation is actually a thing that is living, that responds, and that responds in those unpredictable and sometimes noxious ways. I've jumped over a little bit. There's a really good framework about how tops, middles, bottoms and customers always tend to respond, but we haven't got time. My apologies. So have you got the appetite to do another quick good sport exercise? Stand up, let's stand outside for a minute. So this is another exercise to illustrate the possibilities of what you can do as commissioners.